We see lots of people, businesses, and offices talking about going paperless today. But how much is that really helping the environment? When was the last time you touched a piece of paper? Do you even remember how to write using a pen? Well, for curiosity's sake, I've decided to write a couple of podcast episodes using pen and paper instead of typing out my ideas on my computer. I have to say, it felt really weird at first, especially because I realized how long it had been since I actually physically wrote something down. Of course, I sign things here and there or write down small reminders or ideas on post-it notes, but actually picking up a notebook and filling an entire page with writing was something I hadn't done in years. And I have to say, it felt weird and it looked terrible. I admit my handwriting never was particularly good looking, but not practicing it for a couple of years proved that nothing is so bad that it can't get worse. The reason I tried this out was because I recently read a physical book, like the Neanderthals and the Egyptians used to do. Something I also hadn't done in a long time. E-readers are way more convenient, faster, and honestly, better. As a Dostoevsky fan, physically holding the weight of 1,000 pages while reading a print version of Brothers Karamazov made me realize how humanity really nailed it when they figured out super lightweight e-ink screens. But reading the paperback version of this book simply hit me differently. I felt a different sort of localized geographical connection to the story. Meaning I instinctively knew which part of the book or of the page certain sentence that really hit me was located. Of course, not precisely, but pretty close. The amazing quote, "Above all, don't lie to yourself," is somewhat in the beginning, on the top of a page on the left. But I digress. Because of that, I wondered if writing would be as different as reading, hence the experiment. And of course, it's a completely different thing. Besides having to spend a huge amount of time trying to decipher the occult symbols my out-of-practice hand drew instead of letters, the lack of basically unrestricted editing power typically available on computers forced me to create some sort of courage to commit the sentence in a much more permanent manner. It also compelled me to really think about what I was writing. Almost like I needed another level of intentionality for each sentence. However, even though I try my best, the first page often isn't the final version, nor is the second or the seventh, which means I'm using a lot of paper and discarding most of it. Not exactly the best thing to do considering I'm writing for a sustainability podcast. On the other hand, it's not like typing on my computer could be considered net zero. While no paper is being used, there's a considerable environmental cost in using digital tools, especially in my case since everything I do is synced and backed up to a cloud server. So, what's the most sustainable option here? Tons of sheets of paper or an energy-consuming computer? This question sent me into a deep rabbit hole that started with ebooks and then went through movies, DVDs, CDs, streaming, magazines, and a bunch of other things. Turns out this question has much more than meets the eye. Let's start with the problems of physical media. When you want to produce a book, you start by sending someone to a forest to cut down a tree. This tree is then moved to a paper factory, which transforms it into sheets of paper, which is sold and then transported again to the printing facilities of a publisher. The words will be printed in this book, which will be transported again to stores around the world so people can get into their cars, go to the store, and purchase the book. While cutting down trees is certainly impactful, you can see there's another process that stands out and really takes on the big environmental toll: transportation. Things have to move around a lot. And even though we're evolving on that end, transportation is one of the most impactful economic activities today. And this problem is almost completely deleted by the digital version. You don't need to move a tree. You don't need to put the product in a truck to deliver to a client. You just click a button and you download the files. However, there are some things to consider about the digital version as well. You need something to access it. A phone, a computer, an e-reader, and we're all very aware how hardware production impacts the planet. Yes, you don't need to cut down a tree to read an ebook, but you do need to mine a very specific and often controversial mineral to create the battery that runs the device you use to access that ebook. You need energy to charge that device, and eventually you need to replace it for a new one because it will become obsolete. According to an article by NPR, the average e-reader has a carbon footprint of 80 pounds, meaning you'd need to read about 36 books in order to environmentally break even. That's not a crazy number, but if you're a casual reader that reads, say, a book a month, it will take you 3 years to get there. And even then, there's more points that we need to point out. This doesn't take into account the energy that was used to charge the e-reader or download the files. Mind you, it's not a lot of energy, but it's still there. You also need to think about the carbon footprint of the server that will store and eventually deliver the files. That's a little bit bigger. And finally, this would be the ideally perfect scenario where your e-reader would still function after 3 years. Last point is very interesting to me as I often think about how long things will last. If you take good care of a book, it will outlast every single e-reader out there. Even if the e-reader is built to last, which, let's face it, durability isn't exactly the top priority of most technology companies out there. Some even plan to intentionally make their own hardware less durable so that you have to buy a new one. The CD player my dad bought in the 90s still functions perfectly and honestly much smoother than my old iPod. In fact, those CDs from the 90s and earlier are still going. After they were produced, their carbon footprint didn't really change much. You can't say the same about a music file on a streaming service, which is constantly increasing its own carbon footprint unless the server is turned off. So if you think in the really long run, physical media does have the upper hand here. Another really important point is shareability. If I lend one of my books to a friend, practically nothing changes in its footprint, especially if I ride my bike to meet him. With digital copies, sharing and lending isn't even permitted most of the time, but even if it was, every time my friend would access that copy, energy would be used to power up the e-reader and load up the file. In some cases, even more energy if the file is stored in a cloud server, which will stream it to my friend's device. Think of it this way. How many people can read the same book from a library? Is it better if all these people purchase their own e-reader to download a PDF? So what's the correct answer in the end? Should you buy books or an e-reader? Should you buy CDs or subscribe to a streaming service? Truth is, it really depends. In general, if you tend to read huge amounts of books or listen to a lot of different albums, digital tends to be the best option. But if you like watching the same movie 1,000 times and you really aren't that interested in new music, you have your top 10 albums and you prefer to stick to that, well, in that case, the analog physical might be your way to go. It will actually be cheaper for you. But it always depends. If you live in the middle of nowhere and the book you purchase needs to travel 1,000 miles to get to you, then probably it isn't the best idea to buy the physical version. There's no magic formula, and to be honest, the goal of this episode isn't to give you a straight answer. The idea is for you to think about it, and also so that you don't run the risk of inaccurately saying that going paperless makes you net zero. Thank you for joining us today. The Green Earth Podcast is a Green Earth initiative. Green Earth is a large-scale nature-based project developer, and our goal is to help nature flourish and prosper. If you want to read more about our projects, please check our website, green.earth. The link is also in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving us a review. And if you know anyone that might benefit from this content, we'd greatly appreciate your recommendation. I'm Pedro Zimmer, your host, and I hope to see you for the next episode of the Green Earth Podcast.